of leveling the playing field for the American consumer and help ordinary Americans get a straight deal in our increasingly complex economy. I hope we'll be able to do that. I thank the chair, and I yield the floor. I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored to join and associate myself with the remarks made by my colleague from Rhode Island, who has expressed very forcefully and eloquently the reasons that I believe that Richard Cordray should be confirmed in his nomination as Director of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. This country faces a continuing financial crisis. We see it on the job lines, in the streets, in our communities, and that crisis can be traced to the same abuses that this new agency was approved by the Congress to fight. The laws are good laws. They're designed to protect consumers from those abuses and problems that led to this financial crisis. But the laws are dead letter. They are meaningless unless they are enforced, unless they are enforced vigorously and rigorously, unless consumers are protected not just in word, but in deed. And that is the reason that we should confirm Richard Cordray as the director of the CFPB. The people in this agency are doing good work. They have the authority now to supervise some of the biggest banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions, but they need a director to oversee the work of non-bank financial institutions such as independent payday lenders, non-bank mortgage lenders, non-bank mortgage servicers, debt collectors, credit reporting agencies, and private student lenders, lest anyone think that these are abstract or speculative potential problems. They have only to look to their neighbors and friends who are struggling to stay in their homes, seeking to pay their debts, and facing every day the continuing abuses in these areas. They may be among a minority of actors in this area. The bad actors may be a minority, but they cannot be countered unless Richard Cordray is confirmed. I know from my experience that consumer protection laws are meaningless to ordinary Americans as they are to citizens of Connecticut unless there is vigorous enforcement of these laws. Now, Richard Cordray brings to this job a unique set of qualifications. He has been involved at the local and state level in working closely with community banks and credit unions as well as other financial institutions as a state and county treasurer. He understands the important role that they play in small towns and communities. He knows how to work with institutions and the business people who run them. He's realistic and sensible. He knows common sense. And he has had a positive experience, hands-on, working at the local and state level. I've worked with him personally as an attorney general, worked collaboratively with him, indeed helping to start the investigation of the mortgage service abuses that have led to a nationwide inquiry and hopefully a nationwide solution. I know him to be a practical and sensitive and sensible person who knows how to listen. Richard Cordray knows how to listen to people who are affected by the rulings that he may make, the policies that he may implement, and the people whom he may hire. Indeed, his nomination was praised by a former United States Senator and current Attorney General, Mike DeWine, a Republican who defeated him in 2012. Republicans in this body have made this issue a partisan one. It should not be. There is nothing partisan about debt collectors or mortgage servicers or others who may abuse their trust to consumers. There's nothing partisan about people who become victims of the practices that continue that we need the CFPB to counter. There is nothing partisan, or should be nothing partisan, about this individual, Rich Cordray, who has dedicated his life to protecting ordinary men and women against the financial abuses that the CFPB is designed to fight. Blocking his nomination is very simply a way to stop the CFPB from ending abuses. It may be articulated in a variety of ways using words like accountability or rulemaking or structure or authority as terms that are at issue, but the fact of the matter is his nomination cries out for confirmation simply to implement the important laws that this body has passed, laws that remain dead letter as long as they are not enforced. The men and women who are working in this agency now, under the leadership of Raj Date, are doing the best they can, and they are making a difference. They are protecting, for example, our veterans. Holly Petraeus, who is head of the area in the agency that is designed to protect our veterans, is doing great work in that area, and she deserves the support she needs and merits the support. She and others in that agency need and deserve the support of this Congress and this body in confirming Rich Cordray. I've worked with Rich Cordray. I know him as a man, as a public official, as a potential nominee. And we will be losing a uniquely qualified person for this job if we fail to do the right thing and protect consumers from the continuing abuses of this industry. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor. Quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
initiated. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak about the issue of the payroll tax and the tax cut that we're trying to enact, very similar to what we did last year when Democrats and Republicans came together at the end of the year right before the holiday season and said, we've got to take action now to make sure that we're doing everything possible to jumpstart the economy. One of the elements of that agreement last year, and again it was bipartisan, was a cut in the payroll tax. And just so people understand what my point is about this tax, we know that, and I'll deal only with the employee side, we know that employees in the United States, when they make their payroll tax payment, it's 6.2% of their earnings. Last year we cut that from 6.2 to 4.2. It was the right thing to do, and it had a positive impact. What I'm trying to do now, and I think this is bipartisan, we want to not just do that again, but we want to cut it even more so that we can reduce it in half. So instead of paying 6.2, you're paying 3.1. And the key thing here, and this is a very basic idea, but what we're trying to do, I think, are two basic things. Number one is to give folks out there more take-home pay, kind of dollars in the pocket. Last year it was roughly $1,000 per worker, and the impact on a family, a positive impact of that, is very significant. This year we hope it'll be greater. We hope we can enact something where the take-home pay savings or increase, depending on how you argue it, is almost $1,500 instead of being $900 or $1,000. That for some folks can be $1,500 or $1,400 or somewhere in that range. The second point on this is peace of mind. We ought to take action here, and every once in a while we get this right. Take action here in a bipartisan way that says to people, we're trying to do our best to understand what you're up against. We're trying to take actions here that will lead to economic growth and job creation. One of those is making sure that we reduce the payroll tax so that folks out there have more money in their pocket, more take-home pay as they head into not just the holiday season, but as they head into a new year in 2012. So it really is about take-home pay and peace of mind. And we've made some progress in the last couple of months when we consider where we are trying to dig out of the Great Recession. But unfortunately, the progress we've made is far too modest, and the economic recovery right now is still very vulnerable, fragile. Pick your word. There are lots of ways to describe it. We need this tax cut to boost consumer spending. A lot of business folks that I talk to in Pennsylvania, I'll say, do you want to hire or do you want to increase your payroll? And they say, I'd like to, but I can't. And then I say, why don't you? And they say, there's not enough demand out there. One of the best ways, maybe the best way, to create demand in our economy is to have folks have more take-home pay. As you can see in the chart on my left, if you look at the quarters starting right here, where we see, starting right here where we see minus 6.7%. That's the first quarter of 2009. Eventually, we got to the point where we've started to have some growth. So we've had 9 straight quarters of GDP growth, but not enough, not nearly enough. It is movement in the right direction, but it's been barely positive, as you can see, even if you look at just the last year. That point, the .04 is the first quarter of 2011. So for 2011, we've had, even though we had good growth above almost 4% back in a couple of quarters in 2009 into 2010, the last 3 quarters, meaning 2011, 0.4 growth, 1.3% growth, and 2.0% growth. What we've got to do now is make sure that the fourth quarter is stronger as best we can, but make sure by the actions we take here that 2012 is much better. We need to ensure that we have stronger growth, and putting, as I said before, $1,500 additionally into the pockets of 160 million workers will help substantially. And I think that's that number should be repeated. When we talk about cutting the payroll tax in half, putting more take-home pay in people's pockets, we're talking about affecting 160 million workers in the United States of America. Economists across the board have told us why this is so important. They've reported that the payroll tax cut will create jobs and increase GDP, increase those numbers that I just referred to on the chart. And failing to extend the tax cut will slow growth and lead to fewer jobs. Mark Zandi, one of the economists that both parties have quoted over many years, Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics estimates that not extending the current payroll tax cut, meaning allowing the payroll tax to go back up to the 6.2, not cutting it in half. He said if that happens, it would reduce gross domestic product gross domestic product growth, I should say, by 0.5% in 2012. So instead of having growth, positive growth, he's saying if we don't enact and extend the payroll tax cut from last year at a minimum, that we would be losing a half a point of growth. That would be devastating to this economy. Goldman Sachs has said similar things. Goldman Sachs says they put the negative impact on GDP growth at as much as 0.2% in 2012. Most economists are in that range in terms of the adverse impact. RBC Capital Markets concludes that the hit to GDP next year of failing to act would be a full 1%. So you have an economist saying 0.5% adverse consequence, 2/3 maybe, but at least one among others saying a full percentage point. That would be devastating when we need to see growth at above 2 and hopefully even above 3. But that's been very hard to reach in the last couple of months. I put this chart up on my left just to highlight what Mark Zandi said. Here's his warning when discussing what could happen. On the current payroll tax cut in effect right now, the 4.2 level that we're at right now from the cut from last year, quote, we'd be in recession right now without it. So that's what he said based upon what we did last year in a bipartisan way. I would hope that we could end this year on a high note, on a bipartisan note, and make sure that we cut the payroll tax again and put more take-home pay in people's pockets. And then here's Mark Zandi talking about if we don't extend, what could happen into the near future. We'll likely go into recession. So says Mark Zandi. So we can't afford to do that. The payroll tax cut has helped sustain the economic recovery this year, and it will strengthen the economy in 2012 if we reduce it again. My bill not only extends it, but increases it so that per worker take-home pay increase, instead of being around $1,000, would be approximately $1,500. And we also know that cutting the tax leads to job growth. We know this from our experience, and we know this from recent history. At the end of 2010, Congress enacted the current payroll tax, cutting it, as I said, from 6.2 to 4.2, and it took effect at the beginning of the year. As we look at private sector job growth in 2011, we can see some of the impact of the cut. As we can see on the chart, if you look at the first couple of bars, even if you can't read the smaller print here, this depicts, starting in January of 2011, what was the monthly change in private payrolls, meaning private sector job growth. January was only 94,000, not that great a month, January of 2011. But look at February, 261,000 private sector jobs added. Look at March, 219,000 private sector jobs added, and then April, 241. So you had an average of about 240,000 private sector jobs growing in those 3 months. Now, when we got to May and June, of course, a lot of things happened, which took that number way, way down. It slowed for a lot of reasons. One of them was the spike in oil prices. Another was the effect on gas prices. And finally, the earthquake in Japan had a terrible effect on our economy. So I'm wrapping up here, but I just wanted to make one more point about this. The American people are looking at us right now. They're watching what we do. And they're saying basically two things to us. At least the people in Pennsylvania say it to me. They ask me one basic question. What are you doing to grow the economy and create jobs? What are you doing as an individual member of the United States Senate? One of the ways that I can respond affirmatively and positively is say, we've come together to reduce the payroll tax, and even more than we did last year, to help you and your bottom line, so you have more take-home pay for you and your family. The second thing they ask us is, what are you doing to try to bring people together, to try to reach a bipartisan consensus? And we've all got to try to do that in our own ways. This is really about take-home pay and peace of mind. We need this tax cut in place to boost consumer spending, to create jobs, and accelerate economic growth. And I want to conclude with one thought, because I know it's been raised by a number of folks the last couple of days about Social Security. And I'll first of all, just for purposes of the record, I'd ask consent to enter into the record a letter addressed to Secretary of the Treasury Geithner and Director of Office of Management and Budget Jacob Lew, I should say, dated December the 6th. It's signed by Stephen C. Gross, Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration. I'd ask that that be made part of the record.
Without objection. Senator's time has expired.
I'd ask consent for 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
The point of this letter is very simple. I won't read the whole letter, but here's the pertinent part of this letter. Quote, the end of the first paragraph, we, meaning the Social Security Administration, quote, we estimate that the projected level of the old age and survivors insurance and disability insurance trust funds would be unaffected by enactment of this provision in my bill, unquote. What he's talking about there is Social Security. It would be unaffected. The trustees said last year the same thing, and I won't add all this to the record, just read the one sentence. This is page 33 of a report from last year. Therefore, this payroll tax cut from last year is estimated to have no financial impact on these same trust accounts. So it's abundantly clear that there's no impact on Social Security, and secondly, it's abundantly clear that passing a payroll tax cut again will boost job growth, strengthen the economy, and grow the economy, and give American families some measure of peace of mind as we head into the holidays and head into the year 2012. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa is recognized.
Before I speak, I have a unanimous consent request that Ty Krogan, an intern in Senator DeMint's office, be granted floor privileges for today's session of the Senate.
Without objection.
The alcohol, tobacco, firearms is a division of the Justice Department. I have been investigating alcohol, tobacco, firearms, Operation Fast and Furious for almost 11 months now. It's past time for accountability at the senior levels of the Justice Department. That accountability needs to start with the head of the Criminal Division, Lanny Breuer. I believe it's time for him to go, and I'd like to explain why I've come to that conclusion. The Justice Department denied in a letter to me on February 4th, 2011, that ATF had ever walked guns. Mr. Breuer had been consulted in the drafting of that erroneous letter of February the 4th this year. On May the 2nd, 2011, rather than acknowledging the increasingly obvious facts and apologizing for its February letter, the Justice Department reiterated its denial. And that was on May 2nd this year. Same denial of February the 4th. Thus, when the Justice Department revealed on October 31st of this year that Breuer had known as far back as April 2010 about gun walking at ATF, I was astounded. That was a shocking revelation. The controversy about gun walking and Fast and Furious has been escalating steadily for 10 months now. The Justice Department had publicly denied to Congress that ATF would ever walk guns. Yet the head of the criminal division, Mr. Brewer, knew otherwise and said nothing. He knew that the same field division was responsible for walking guns in 2006-2007 case, and that case was called Wide Receiver. But the real shock of how Mr. Brewer had responded within his own department when that earlier gun walking was first brought to his attention in April 2010. He didn't tell the Attorney General. He didn't tell the Attorney General's Chief of Staff. He didn't tell the Deputy Attorney General. He didn't tell the Inspector General. Instead, he simply told his deputies to meet with ATF leadership and inform them of the gun walking, quote, so they know the bad stuff that could come out, end of quote. Later, his deputy outlined a strategy to, quote, announce the case without highlighting the negative part of the story and risking embarrassing ATF. Now think about that. In that case, saving face was more important than the bad policy. For 18 months, the embarrassing truth about ATF gun walking in Wide Receiver and Brewer's knowledge of it was successfully hidden. It only came out because of the congressional investigation into gun walking in Fast and Furious. The public outrage over Fast and Furious comes from the average American who cannot understand why their very own government would intentionally allow criminals to illegally buy weapons for trafficking into Mexico. Next week, it will be 1 year since Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was murdered by bandits armed with guns as a direct result of this policy of letting guns walk. The Terry family and all Americans who sympathize with their loss are rightfully outraged and astonished at their very own government doing such a thing. Yet when Mr. Brewer learned of a case where ATF walked guns in a very similar way, all he did was give ATF a heads up. There seems to be a vast gulf between what outrages the American people and what outrages Lanny Breuer. Mr. Brewer showed a complete lack of judgment by failing to object to the gun walking that he knew about in April 2010, 9 months before I was ever aware of Fast and Furious. If Mr. Brewer had reacted to gun walking in Wide Receiver the way most Americans reacted to gun walking in Fast and Furious, he would have taken steps to stop it and hold accountable everyone involved. Consequently, Fast and Furious might have been stopped in its tracks and Brian Terry may be alive. When Mr. Brewer came before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism the day after those revelations, I gave him a chance to explain himself. I listened to what he had to say. He told us that he, quote, thought that dealing with the leadership of ATF was sufficient and reasonable, end of quote. Clearly, it was not sufficient. Mr. Brewer even admitted as much, saying, quote, I regret that I did not alert others within the leadership of the Department of Justice to the tactics used in Operation Wide Receiver when they first came to my attention, end of quote. He regrets not bringing gun walking in Wide Receiver to the attention of the Attorney General. But what about bringing it to the attention of Congress He didn't even step forward to express his regret until emails that he detailed his knowledge were about to be produced under congressional subpoena. It's astounding, then, that it took the public controversy over Fast and Furious to help the chief of the criminal division realize that walking guns is unacceptable. He'd had 9 months after the February 4th letter to step forward, correct the record, and come clean with the American public. He had 18 months after learning of gun walking in wide receiver to put a stop to it and hold people accountable. He failed to do so. During his testimony, I asked him point blank if he reviewed that letter of February 4th before it was sent to me. His misleading answers to these questions formed the basis for my second reason for calling for Mr. Brewer to resign. He responded that he couldn't say for sure, but suggested that he did not review the letter. He said, quote, "At that time, I was in Mexico dealing with the very real issues that we're all so committed to," end of quote. Now, last Friday, the Justice Department withdrew their February 4th letter to me because of its inaccuracies. And the word inaccuracy is their words. The department also turned over documents under subpoena about who participated in the drafting and the reviewing of the letter. So you can imagine my surprise when I discovered from documents provided Friday night that Mr. Brewer was far more informed during the drafting of that letter than he admitted before the Judiciary Committee. In fact, Mr. Brewer got frequent updates on the status of the letter while he was in Mexico. He was sent versions of the letter 4 times. 2 versions were emailed to Mr. Brewer on February 4th after he returned from Mexico, including the version of the letter that was ultimately sent to me that day. At that time, he forwarded the letter to his personal email account. Mr. Brewer's deputy also sent him 2 drafts of the letter while he was in Mexico, and he also forwarded one of those to his personal email account. We do not know whether he did that in order to access it on a larger screen than the government-issued BlackBerry. I asked for an additional 5 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
We do not know whether he did that in order to access it on a larger screen than a government-issued BlackBerry, or whether he engaged in any further discussion about the letter in his non-government email account. However, we do know that in response to the draft received in Mexico, he wrote to one of the main drafters of the letter, quote, unquote, "as usual, great work." The Justice Department excluded Brewer's compliment about the context of the draft from the set of emails it released to the press on Friday before they released those documents to this senator. That evening, Mr. Brewer submitted answers to written questions. He wrote, quote, "I have no recollection of having seen the letter, and given that I was on official travel that week, and given the scope of my duties as Assistant Attorney General, I think it is exceedingly unlikely that I did so," end of quote. So as late as last Friday night, Mr. Brewer was still trying to minimize his role in reviewing the letter despite all the evidence to the contrary. Why would Mr. Brewer say, quote, unquote, "great work" to a staffer about a letter he claimed that he had not read? It just isn't credible that someone like Mr. Brewer would forget about his involvement in the matter like this. Mr. Brewer's failure to be candid and forthcoming before this body irreparably harms his credibility. His complete lack of judgment and failure to deal with gun walking when he first learned of it in April 2010 was bad enough. But this is the final straw. Mr. Brewer has lost my confidence in his ability to effectively serve the Justice Department. If you can't be straight with the Congress, you don't need to be running the criminal division. It's time to stop spinning and start taking responsibility. I have long said that the highest-ranking official who knew about gun walking in Operation Fast and Furious needs to be held accountable. That standard applies no less to officials who knew about gun walking in Operation Wide Receiver. Gun walking is unacceptable no matter when it occurred. Documents make clear that Assistant Attorney General Brewer was the highest-ranking official in the Justice Department who knew about gun walking in Operation Wide Receiver. He did nothing to correct the problem, alert others to the issue, take responsibility, or even admit what he knew until he was forced to do so by the evidence. Therefore, I believe Attorney General needs to ask for Mr. Brewer's resignation or remove him from office if he refuses. If Mr. Brewer wants to do the honorable thing, he would resign. Now, I'm not somebody who flippantly calls for resignations. I've done oversight for many years, and in all that time, I don't ever remember coming across a government official who so blatantly placed sparing agencies' embarrassment over protecting the lives of citizens. He has failed to do his job of ensuring that the government operate properly, including holding people accountable. Because of that, Mr. Brewer needs to go immediately. Anything less will show the American people that the Justice Department isn't serious about being honest with Congress in our attempt to get to the bottom of this. In regard to my attempt to get to the bottom, just last night the Justice Department sent a letter refusing to provide several Justice Department staff for transcribed interviews. The letter explicitly goes back on the assurances that I received when I consented to proceed with confirmations of 3 senior Justice Department officials, which I'd held up to get an agreement to get the information that Congress is entitled to. One of my conditions for agreeing to proceed with those nominations was that officials who agreed to voluntary interviews in this investigation would have either a personal lawyer present or a department lawyer present, but not both. I personally met with the Attorney General, and he had the conditions listed on a piece of paper in front of him. It looked as if he had read it and was familiar with it, yet he never objected to that condition. Dozens of witnesses' interviews have been conducted under that understanding with no problem. The only difference now is that instead of ATF witnesses, we are now seeking to interview Justice Department witnesses. Well, what's good for the good is good for the gander. 30 more seconds, please. There's no reason to change the rules in the middle of the game. I was relying on the Attorney General and other officials at the Department to honor their agreement. Apparently, that's not going to happen. Fortunately, Chairman Issa has the ability to require the witness to appear via subpoena if they refuse to appear voluntarily under conditions that the Department previously agreed to with me. I'm confident that he will do that if it becomes necessary, and I will take whatever steps I have to take here in the Senate to encourage the Department to reconsider and stick to its original agreement. I yield the floor.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Mr. President, I'm delighted to stand before you on this Delaware Day, 2011. This is the anniversary of the day when, on December 7th, 1787, Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution. For one whole week, Delaware was the entire United States of America. And then we opened things up and let in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, eventually New Mexico. I think for the most part it's turned out well, especially the New Mexico part. And we're happy to be here to celebrate this day with all of our colleagues. Later today, Senator Coons and I will return to regale our colleagues with more about what we started all those years ago and how it's turned out. I want to fast forward, if I could, though, to 2008. And as the presiding officer will recall, during the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis on Wall Street, one question which Congress repeatedly asked itself was, what can we do to prevent future harm from reaching Main Street? What can we do to prevent future harm from reaching Main Street? This theme continued as we considered and ultimately passed in 2010 comprehensive financial regulatory reform legislation, which a majority of us, including myself, supported. That legislation now known as the Dodd-Frank Law. While not all of us were able to agree on each of the elements of the Dodd-Frank Law, and while some of my colleagues did not support it in the end, most of us could agree that we needed to do more to help protect American families and businesses from bad actors. As a result, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created. For the first time in history, one agency will be charged with overseeing consumer protection for Main Street Americans within the financial industry. In July of this year, 5 months ago, Richard Cordray was nominated to be director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mr. President, Richard Cordray served for many years as the president pro tem of the Delaware State Senate before retiring roughly 10 years ago. A man now in his probably mid-70s. I was shocked to hear that he'd been nominated to head up this new agency. It turned out it's another Richard Cordray. And this Richard Cordray had been the Attorney General of Ohio for a number of years, well regarded, and where he helped to protect consumers, investors, retirees, and business owners to ensure Americans on Main Street got a fair deal. At the time of his nomination, he was leading the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's enforcement efforts. Mr. Cordray, former AG, is someone who's been intimately involved with getting the new Bureau stood up and running, and who brings key expertise to the table. When we first passed the law, Mr. President, I suggested to the President, to Secretary Geithner and others, I said, I think there's really 3 models that you can use to choose from to pick someone to nominate to head this new Bureau. One, you could pick an academician. 2, you could pick somebody who's been a regulator, or in this case, maybe an Attorney General. And the third, I said you might want to try finding somebody in the private sector who's run a significant financial service company, but who had a great, impeccable record out of a white hat for consumer protection, for looking out for consumers, somebody who believes you can do well and do good at the same time. And I thought those are the 3 models. And the administration looked at people in all 3 of those categories, including the latter one, and ultimately decided that within the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they had Mr. Cordray, and that he had a good track record, and he was the person that the President wanted to nominate. And I think he's made a very good choice. I talked to a number of my colleagues who sat in on hearings where he testified on his nomination, and for the most part got good reviews from Democrats and Republicans here. So, as my colleagues and I debate his nomination and ask ourselves, is he qualified to do the job? I think the answer is yes. My colleagues on the State Banking Committee agreed, and 37 Attorney Generals from across the country, both Republican and Democrat, agreed. However, today's debate has not been about whether Mr. Cordray is qualified to do this job. Instead, the debate is focused on the structure of the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In May of this year, 44 of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle sent a letter to the President saying that they would block any nominee until structural changes are made in a new agency. This was before the President had ever nominated Mr. Cordray. My colleagues want to see changes made, such as replacing the director with a board structure and subjecting the Bureau to the appropriations process. My colleagues, 44 colleagues in any event, pointed out that these structural changes would model the Bureau after already existing agencies, while some of my other colleagues have also made the point that there are already existing agencies not subject to the appropriations process, like the FDIC and the Federal Reserve. Mr. President, what we have here today is a disagreement, one where colleagues on both sides of the aisle have what I believe are legitimate points. The Consumer Bureau was created in Dodd-Frank through a series of compromises, and rarely is any compromise perfect. And Presiding Officer and I have been involved in enough compromises over the years to know that if, in the end, neither side is fully satisfied with the compromise, maybe you struck a pretty good balance, and I think that's the case here. At the end of the day, however, the point of the Consumer Bureau is to put the consumer first. And I'll be the first to admit that there's no such thing as a perfect law, and I'm sure that our colleagues that are here and back in their offices and in committee hearings would agree with that. If there are aspects of Dodd-Frank that can be tweaked and improved, then we ought to do that. But at the end of the day, we must put financial protection of consumers above our disagreements and our personal preferences. The longer we continue to constrain the Bureau by denying it a leader and only discussing the structural changes that some members would like to see made, the greater the disservice to consumers across America. The Bureau's authority was created so that it would not just be limited to banks. Those institutions are already regulated. So are credit unions. So are bank holding companies. The Bureau's authority is supposed to extend to non-banks as well. Non-banks which provide a form of financial service, including payday lenders and debt collectors. Prior to Dodd-Frank, non-bank entities were subject to little, if any, federal supervision, yet their reach and use across our country is widespread. As a result, many unscrupulous actors were able to exploit loopholes and harm American consumers. And that's not to say that all payday lenders or all debt collectors are unscrupulous actors. They're not. And they're not all out there to exploit the loopholes. But too many of them do. And they do so without the kind of supervision that they should receive. However, without a director in place, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does not have the authority to supervise these very entities. This drastically undermines the very spirit in which the Bureau was created. And it's not just the consumers who are harmed, but our small community institutions as well. Mr. President, these community institutions want to see a level playing field where they can compete and where everyone plays by the rules. Consumers and businesses need certainty. They need predictability. I hear that almost every day, especially from businesses. Without certainty, without predictability in a whole wide range of areas, we continue to see our economic recovery hindered. I think I've shared with the presiding officer before a story that I think is germane here today to this discussion. And it goes back about 7 or 8 years ago when I was working on clean air legislation to deal with how do we reduce the emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide and mercury and carbon dioxide, issues that we debate from time to time in the Environmental Public Works Committee where we serve. And I remember having one day we had 7 or 8 utility CEOs in from across the country and discussing the merits of different legislative proposals. Finally, one crusty old CEO of a utility down south said to me, he said, "Look, Senator, here's what you should do. You should figure out what the rules are going to be, use some common sense, give us a reasonable amount of time to comply with them, and get out of the way." That's what he said. I thought that was those words are really words of great wisdom, and not just for clean air legislation, but also here today. We can't afford to drag this disagreement out in perpetuity. We must empower this Bureau to look out for Main Street as was envisioned with the creation of the Bureau. When we may have to look at the idea of a commission-based structure, and I'd love to sit down with my colleagues from the other side of the aisle and discuss that option if the former Attorney General Cordray's nomination continues to be blocked later this week. But right now, we have the ability to move forward in standing by our words and by the spirit of the law, by looking out for every American with a mortgage, a credit card, and those looking to send their kids to college. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting Mr. Cordray's nomination. It's the right thing to do, and it is our opportunity to show the American consumers that we're putting them first, ahead of partisan politics, by governing as we were meant to do in the first place. I'll just close with this. I see Senator Webb of Virginia has joined us here on the floor. I'll just close before I turn it over to him maybe on a little brighter note. It's a gloomy day here in our nation's capital. It's been cloudy all day, raining, sometimes pretty hard. When I was trying to walk up here from the train station, it was. But going back to the issue of uncertainty and lack of predictability, I think the greatest impediment to getting a modest economic recovery going and turning it into a robust economic recovery, one of the things that we need to do, can best do, to make that happen is to address so much of the uncertainty and lack of predictability. Then it really revolves around a bunch of issues here that we say grace over. Can we demonstrate to those who question our ability here to find the middle, to reach across the aisle, can we still demonstrate the ability to govern? Are we able to demonstrate through an approach much like the Bowles-Simpson Deficit Commission plan, the ability to get us back on the right track in terms of reducing our debt? What's going to happen with the health care law? Is it going to be deemed constitutional or unconstitutional? What about the tax code? You know, what's going to happen in a year from now? And what are going to happen to all these tax provisions that expire at the end of this month? A lot about lack of certainty, lack of predictability. We need to deal with that. But I want to mention 2 or 3 promising signs, and I'll close. We got earlier this month some new job numbers for the month of November. The unemployment rate dropped down to 8.6%, and before we stand and celebrate for that, there's still a whole lot of people we know that don't have a job or are looking for a job. But a lot of people stopped looking for a job, and that's one of the reasons why that number has dropped. But here's the good news. There are about 120,000 private sector jobs created last month, about 100,000 the month before, roughly 200,000 a month before. That's about 140,000 per month. And we're actually starting to see growth occurring not just over a couple of months, but now for well over a year, private sector job creation. Not the numbers that we'd like, but in the right direction. And the other thing I'd say, we're seeing a regrowth, a rebirth of revitalization occurring in the manufacturing sector of our economy. Some of you know we have something called a manufacturing index. If it sits at 50, it means manufacturing sector is not growing, it's not shrinking. It's been over 50 for, I think, about 25 consecutive months. And we're seeing really a resurgence in manufacturing in this country, which encourages me to believe that what the President's trying to do, see us double exports over a 5-year period of time, it's not just a pipe dream. This is something that might just might happen. And it's aided and abetted by the 3 free trade agreements that we passed last month or 2. So on those happier notes, I want to say on this Delaware Day, Mr. President, thanks for giving me the time to talk about some leadership that's needed and the ability, the willingness to compromise if we can't get Mr. Corley confirmed here this week. I thank you for this time. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.